Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Well, good morning and welcome to the latest edition of the Moggcast. I'm Mark Wallace, the Executive Editor of Conservative Home, and joining me, of course, is the man himself, Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, how are you?
Good morning, very well, thank you.
This week's Moggcast, of course, is broadcast directly from the outer circles of hell, courtesy of Donald Tusk. I'm not necessarily surprised to be here. I'm surprised to see you here.
I'm not sure that Mr. Tusk is the greatest theologian the world has ever produced and is a little bit confused about the difference between heaven and hell.
Do you think there's a prospect for purgatory in his meaning?
Well, the great thing about purgatory is you always then end up in heaven. So getting to purgatory is a success, and I think the implementation period will be purgatory because we will be subject to EU rules, we'll have no say over them, but we know it has a fixed end date.
It's perhaps the scenic route.
That's another way of looking at it,
terms.
yes. Though the scenery won't be very nice, it will be driving through unpleasant bits of countryside rather than driving through northeast Somerset.
Understood. And so what do you think the EU, such as, we talk about the EU as if it's one unified institution, what do you think the senior figures of the EU who started stirring this pot kind of over the last few days, what do you think they're up to? Do you think they have an agenda, or do you think that they're just going to do things that are quite satisfying to them?
I think it's probably the latter. It's very strange, the Tusk comment, which was clearly deliberate. He clearly wanted to get this off his chest. That extraordinary card that Mr. Varadkar delivered to Mr. Juncker saying this was the first time Ireland had been stronger than Britain and how the British didn't care for peace in Ireland and all this sort of rubbish. And why would they want to do that? I think it is just the display of the anger and hostility they've long felt to the country within the European Union that has always been most suspicious of its political aims. Bear in mind that Donald Tusk and Mr. Juncker are both very much federalists. They don't believe in a European Union of nation states, they believe in a single European Union. That's what they're working towards. And we have blown a raspberry at it, and a very large raspberry we want to leave. And that's why I think they talk in these over-emotional terms, and for Tusk, religious terms, because belief in a federal Europe is almost a religious belief. And therefore, if you don't go along with it, you're a heretic. If you're a heretic, where do you go?
And in this anti-pantheon of heretics, from the perspective of Tusk and Juncker, Verhofstadt, etc., we obviously see people who in the UK are quite mainstream politicians, all those, in Tusk's terms, who promoted the idea of Brexit. Do you think perhaps they've forgotten the alternative to more mainstream politicians? It's notable that Nigel Farage has now announced that he's registered a new Brexit party. Do you think Brussels has simply forgotten, or is it discounting the risk of what might come otherwise?
I think what you're saying is really important, and the interesting thing about UK Euroscepticism is that it has been very mainstream. It's been within the confines of normal political parties. In continental Europe, this hasn't been true, that the greatest hostility to the EU has come from really quite extreme parties and has indicated political tensions that this country has fortunately been able to avoid. And I think this is an issue that they're overlooking and is one that could become serious. I would be very concerned if there were a delay in our departure date, that would be the way for Tommy Robinson to win the European elections. Because say we have a delay, and Tommy Robinson is now linked one way or another to UKIP. If we go beyond July, then there would be European elections. And I think you would see in an election that people don't really care about, they've never felt very important in their lives, to an organisation that we still are at least nominally leaving, that it would be a free hit to vote for an extremist. Bear in mind, it wasn't that long ago that the BNP won seats in the European Parliament. It is an opportunity to protest, and I think the protest would be huge if the date had been delayed. And the EU, by being so obsessed by ever closer union, by the federal state, has actually created the conditions where extreme parties thrive. And I think you see that in what's happening in other European countries even more clearly.
So in that sense, a new Farage Brexit party is distinctly preferable to a Tommy Robinson-dominated UKIP.
I don't think the new Farage Party will be where the votes go in the event that leaving the European Union is stopped, and delayed means stopped. What Yvette Cooper is doing is trying to stop Brexit. It's silly to pretend that this is really about delaying and accepting the result. It's not. It's about stopping Brexit. And Tony Blair let the cat out of the bag yesterday when he said that once we'd left, that was it. There's no going back. And therefore, the people who want us to stay in are using delay as a means to achieve their longer-term goal of preventing us from leaving altogether. I think that creates a very strong reaction, and a reaction that is beyond Nigel Farage and the type of UKIP that he used to run, towards the extreme views of Tommy Robinson.
And does that apply to things like the local elections as well? Does it spill over, in your view?
I doubt it does, because it's not so easy to stand in local elections, and the number of candidates you need to get is very large, and UKIP is currently on the back foot in local elections. Lost a lot of candidates last time round. So I would have thought the local elections will present different challenges, and that it'll be mainly around motivating Tories to go out to vote. It would be if we got to European elections, which nobody cares about anyway. So it becomes a much freer hit than in a local council election, where you wouldn't really want your rate set and your council tax set by somebody whose views you broadly weren't in sympathy with, but might vote for as a protest.
Because it's often said by the James O'Briens of the world that the EU referendum was something that was promised by David Cameron in response to an internal issue. There's no popular demand or concern about the EU, which seems to obviously forget the fact that UKIP won a national election.
Indeed. Mr. O'Brien, as with many people on the left, often selects the facts that suit his argument.
And so, with this question of new parties kind of emerging, kind of implicit to what you've just said about the idea that votes would flow to a kind of to what's left of UKIP, this kind of Tommy Robinson, the kind of Tommy Rot party, you might call it. Implicit to that is actually that their name recognition is quite a powerful thing. We have this kind of fantasy in this country that it's really easy to set up new parties, flattered a little bit, I suspect, by the Macron delusion, the fact that Emmanuel Macron was able in France to step forward and suddenly sweep into power in a completely different electoral system, but also by the fact that people forget UKIP took 2 decades of really quite hard work to even become an outsider party.
Setting up new parties is extraordinarily difficult in our system. It's why they very rarely happen with any success. And since the franchise has been everybody over the age of 21, obviously then lowered to 18, you found that it's basically been stuck in a 2-party system, which has been very hard to change. And the SDP tried, and the Liberals keep on trying to come back. And UKIP had a very strong go at it, but actually in the end it's very hard to win the necessary seats. So the 2-party structure is deeply entrenched, and I think would be hard to overturn. Also, the Macron example is, as you say, a completely different electoral system, and the results of it may not encourage people to follow in those footsteps, that if you look at what's going on in France at the moment, and the quite extraordinary decision of France to recall its ambassador from Italy, which I think has been much under-commented on, because the last time this happened, France and Italy were going to war with each other. The removal of an ambassador is not some I'm a bit angry with you diplomatic step. It is our relations have completely broken down diplomatic step. And for 2 EU countries to be in the situation where their diplomatic relations have completely broken down is extraordinary, and in reality shows that finding a president who nobody has heard of his party before and it's all invented, you may end up with somebody remarkably thin-skinned who makes decisions for the country that are simply rash.
You've sensed the direction in which my questions were creeping on this. In terms of, because Italy and France have both essentially had their pre-established mainstream parties have been swept away. In your sense, in France, the opposition is now an unattractive choice between the Front National or the Gilets jaunes rioting, or what's left of them rioting on the streets. Do you think, is it the British political system which entrenches the parties, or are the British parties, do you think, uniquely resilient? Is there something about them which makes them particularly long-lasting, even in the face of turbulence?
I think first past the post is almost inevitably a guarantee of stability. You see, if you look at what's happened in Germany with a complex proportional system, you find that however you vote, it doesn't change anything. So at the last general election in Germany, both major parties lost, and so they just carried on in government regardless. If you look at Italy, you had to go to extreme parties before you could get anything to change. And then you have a coalition of extreme parties rather than a single party with a mandate that's able to do anything. France is slightly more complicated because of the presidential powers and so on. But equally, it has a two-stage system, and the two-stage system, in the end, encourages complete overthrow of what there was before rather than working with what there was before. So, in my view, the British political system, first past the post, helps provide this stability, and that's been very important because everybody knows that how you vote at the next election can change the government fundamentally, whereas in Germany, they don't care how you vote, really. They'll carry on with the same establishment approach.
Which is one of the warnings given about AV at the time of the referendum, that it would lead to a conspiracy of parties against people.
Absolutely.
Speaking of which, Theresa May has replied to Jeremy Corbyn's letter about seemingly acceding to the principle of talks with him after each side has offered and then scuttled away a little bit from the prospect. What did you make of her letter?
I think both sides are pretending that they want to talk to each other when neither side in reality wants to have any conversation at all. That Jeremy Corbyn doesn't want to rescue Theresa May's policy, and Theresa May doesn't want to follow Jeremy Corbyn's policy. But they both see that in PR terms, ignoring each other is damaging. So he sends a letter saying, why don't we stay in the European Union after all, essentially, because that's what it asks for. And she replies saying, well, that's a very interesting point. I think your third paragraph is worth focusing on, but I disagree with your second paragraph, to try and keep, or words to that effect, to try and keep the positive PR momentum of having offered to talk to him in the first place. I don't think either side wants to sit down and hammer out an agreement that both parties then vote for, not least because neither of them would carry the bulk of their party with them if they made such an agreement.
Meanwhile, it's in the interest of each to continue this process without any resolution, in which they're joined by the Commission, which is hoping, presumably, for another vote that might offer the chance of delay.
It's very hard to know what either side wants. That Theresa May wants her deal, but that was very heavily defeated. But it's not now clear what the Prime Minister wants to replace that. Jeremy Corbyn has been doing the job of an opposition leader. He has been opposing, and it's the job of the opposition leader to oppose things rather than to propose solutions. And so his letter was an attempt to propose a solution, but obviously one that the government couldn't accept. So it is hard to work out where the individual participants want to go.
This raises the odds of an unintentional no deal, should we say?
Yes, that the government is not going to make no deal its policy, and the opposition isn't going to make no deal its policy. But there is the risk of that happening if both sides stay exactly where they are. So if the Prime Minister carries on with her withdrawal agreement, then that is very unlikely to go through. And then you have the question of which is more likely, not leaving at all or leaving without an agreement. That's why the Malthouse compromise came into being, because I want us to leave and I don't really mind about an agreement or not, but I want us to leave. I prefer an agreement on balance, but I'm not worried about leaving and moving to WTO terms. But the other side of the Conservative Party don't mind about not leaving. They would be much happier to stay, but they've accepted the referendum result and genuinely have, and this is very important, that some of the people in the Malthouse discussions are passionate believers in the European project, but have accepted the democratic mandate that we've got to leave, and therefore working to make it as successful as they think it can be. And they want to stop the risk of leaving without any arrangement, and therefore willing to come together on a compromise. So those are the two motives for coming together with the Malthouse compromise.
And as ever, we're recording this on the Monday morning, and the episode will be released on the Tuesday. But this morning, a lot of the discussion around the possibility of an unintended no deal has moved on to the questions of currency and sterling. I see that Boris Johnson, I think, told the Today programme sterling will do what sterling will do. David Davis has talked about potentially some of the upsides of a fall in the value of sterling. What's your, that's a two-parter question really, what's your view of what would happen, and what's your value judgment on the goodness or badness of that effect?
Well, we are in my business office at Somerset Capital Management, so I suppose for regulatory purposes I ought to make it clear I'm not giving investment advice, because I don't think I'm regulated to do so. I think Boris is right that sterling will do what sterling does, that sterling is an automatic safety valve for the economy, and you've seen that work very effectively on other occasions. What you have to ask yourself is, why does sterling move, and what is that about? The question is, at what price is the UK a country where people want to continue to invest, and at what price are our goods economic to sell abroad? That's what it relates to. And sterling was widely thought to be overvalued in 2016 when the referendum took place, though it was at risk of going up further, partly because of the loose monetary conditions in the EU and US at the time. US monetary policy has tightened subsequently, though that seems to be coming to an end, and EU monetary easing has eased off rather than stopped. And the UK, which was tightening, now seems to have paused its tightening. So within that, there are the ingredients for other currencies to be more attractive, looking at monetary policy in the major currency blocks. On the other hand, foreign investment is still flowing into the UK very nicely, and this is very important, a significant part of our economic activity. And that indicates that foreign investors currently think that the price of goods in the UK and of investments is attractive enough to put money in. So you'll have to weigh up where monetary policy goes and what the value of UK assets and goods are to decide where sterling will go, because that's what will determine it.
One thing we've heard on this front is reports that the Treasury's preparations for that possible outcome, what's been termed Project After, the idea of taxes would go down, VAT could be cut, perhaps benefits could rise, the freeze could be lifted, and perhaps regulatory reductions, the prospect of waving through imports with fewer checks at the borders. This doesn't sound like a very scary project fear to a lot of people.
It sounds very exciting, doesn't it? Why aren't we doing this anyway? If we can afford to do this, let's get on with the tax cuts. Let's show that leaving the European Union, we can have a thriving and exciting economy. Let's cut tariffs. Let's cut the tariffs on all goods that we don't produce, and say that that's what we'll do on the 30th of March. Why should we make British consumers worse off to subsidise incompetent, inefficient continental manufacturers? It is not in our interest, and those tariffs should go.
Do you think this is one reason why audiences on Question Time have started to unnerve commentators by cheering the prospect of no deal, in the sense that people are weighing up the actual outcome? Or do you think it's, going back to the first question we talked about, do you think it's something more visceral? Do you think there's a cultural kind of developed dislike of the way in which Brussels is acting?
Oh, I think it's both. I think Brussels' behaviour has made many people feel that they were right to vote to leave. It's reinforced their vote, and it's made those who voted Remain because they were worried about one thing or another, but a very balanced view, come to the conclusion we're better off out of an organisation that dislikes us so much. So I think in those terms what Brussels has done has been helpful to the Brexit cause. But I also think people are realising that Project Fear was not accurate in 2016 and it won't be accurate now, that the sun will still rise. I can't promise it will shine considering the UK's weather on the 30th of March, regardless of whether or not we're in the European Union.
And ought there to be some form of consequences for those forecasts to have either been so biased or so wrong? One might take the view that a Chancellor, who could remain nameless, hypothetically was meddling with the forecasters or was cherry-picking from them, or one might make the view that forecasters were doing everything in good conscience but were simply making mistakes.
I think people should simply spend more time studying history, because these forecasts are always wrong. I've been listening on audiobooks to Andrew Roberts' excellent Churchill biography, and obviously there's a period on the gold standard and Churchill's period as Chancellor. And everybody was saying to him that he had to go back on the gold standard. That was the only choice. The only person who was against it was Keynes, who was considered to be just cranky on this subject. And Keynes, of course, was right, and the consensus was wrong. Consensus economic forecasting is no good at inflection points. It only works in a steady state. So, like a weather forecast, when it basically says next year will be the same as this year, plus 2% or plus 3%, it's got a very good chance of being right. When it says, there's going to be a major change and this is what will happen, it is almost invariably wrong. And why is that? Well, I think it's partly the limitations of the forecasters, the limitations of the models that they use, which can't capture sufficient data, and that individual behaviour is not as neatly predictable as economists anticipate. So the reactions, unintended consequences, are hard to forecast. And I think this is where politicians may be useful, that they need to make a judgment about what they think the effects will be, rather than assuming that there is an authoritative source that will tell them what the consequences will be, because those authoritative sources have been historically consistently wrong.
And my final question is on another form of authoritative source, John Humphrys,
yes,
who reported to be departing. You said the other day, I think you tweeted, when Dr. Victoria Bateman appeared very vividly on the Today programme, and she challenged you to a naked debate, I believe. You tweeted that John Humphrys was perhaps demob happy. I can't have been the only one of your Twitter followers who noticed that's not a no to the challenge of a naked debate. So I wanted to reiterate the question on behalf of Dr. Bateman directly. Will you take part in a naked debate with her?
No. The reason I said John Humphrys was demob happy because he raised the question of whether she wanted to debate with a Brexiteer and then threw my name into the pot. I think John Humphrys' departure is the classic error. He is such an impressive interviewer. He is the heart of what political interviewing is about. He is one of those interviewers who, if one is being quizzed by, one is absolutely on one's mettle because his reputation is formidable and he has interviewed everybody in political life back to Margaret Thatcher. And the Today programme has had a bit of a dip in its audience, and so it thinks, well, let's get rid of our most prestigious figure. I think it's an absolutely classic mistake, and I think it's a great pity because he is such a brilliant interviewer who politicians are cautious about being interviewed by, not least because of his reputation, and that gives him an edge in an interview because the politician is going to be slightly sitting on the edge of his seat. So I think it's a great shame he's going, but I did think that was demob happy, and we are fully clothed here, and I attend to all my business properly dressed.
I'm happy to assure all listeners to the Moggcast we are indeed very much fully clothed. Well, thank you, Jacob, on that note, which would be a great relief to almost everybody, I suspect. Thank you as ever for a very interesting discussion.
Great pleasure.
And hopefully we will hear from you soon at the next episode of the Moggcast.
Thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.